the questions with some broad strategic questions, and colleagues will then come in with some other issues around that, if I may. So, first of all, and I will comment, and I know you're very busy and we've had conversations, we will do our best to send everyone packing by 4 o'clock and go out there and keep Londoners safe. So thank you for that. Right, first question for me, and this is for all of yourselves, is broadly speaking, what models of collaboration exist between the Met, City of London and BTP? Let's talk about the broad models, if we may. Anybody
So
first?
I could kick off, Chair. I think I would want to say as an opening that the collaborative and operational relationships between the 3 services represented here today are as chiefs, formally and also informally. And we have a number of collaborative relationships, and as we explore these later on, they will become clearer, that bring us together all the time. We know each other very well as individuals and indeed as forces. We understand each other's terms of reference, constraints, strengths, and areas where we may be able to help each other. We have the very long-standing Benbow arrangements. I'm sure we'll come back to that in your questions about counter-terrorism and public order and major incidents, which have been demonstrated in the horrific incidents of last year so very well that we come together seamlessly to support the capital. We, of course, are very active partners in things like the London Resilience Forum. We think of ourselves as a region in many respects, whether you're talking about counter-terrorism, you're talking about organised crime. We have a variety of different arrangements. And as we go through this afternoon, you'll hear about times where one of us is providing a paid service to the other, where we have a completely joint unit, where we are seeking to collaborate on estates, whatever it may be. And I think I can speak for all of us, the others will want to join in when I say that we believe we're in very good shape, we're not complacent, and we know we have further areas in the future where we can collaborate even more closely. But London is getting a very good service from the tri-service arrangements at the moment.
I'm sure others. Paul, did you want to comment? Paul gives in to
yes, I concur with everything that the Commissioner said. I think it works incredibly well in a variety of different arenas. We saw specifically during last summer how that operates in extremis, and equally, I think as we go through today, you'll see how that works on a very tactical level as well as at a strategic level. And I think the strength of us acting as a region, which is quite interesting for me, running a national force, is that we recognise how we're leaning into the national work that's going on through National Police Chiefs Council, the work on specialist capabilities review, making sure that as a region we are linked into that. And I recognise that sort of some 60% of my resources are focused in London and the South East. And so London and the forces and the organisations in London are a really important strategic partner, and we drive much of our activity improvement work through that relationship.
Alistair, do you want to add at all at this stage?
Thank you. I suppose just to support both my colleagues in the view that the current levels of collaboration in London between the 3 forces are unprecedented, and I say that as someone that spent a significant amount of time in the Met before moving to the city, so I've seen it from 2 angles really, and I think at the strategic, tactical and operational level across a whole range of policing disciplines, we are in a really, really good position, whether it's the CT world on 3 levels of strategic, tactical, operational, all the way through to serious violence, economic crime, safeguarding and mental health. Looking across those areas, for example, there is some very, very joined up working and interoperable working across all of those areas. So really just to support those points, Chair.
We will explore this with specific issues later. I mean, clearly the scene set, this is a marriage of forces that's dictated to us by acts of government. This may not be by choice, this is where we are through different legislation, and you are describing today how you're working together to make best use of that and best benefit of that, and we understand that, which is really helpful. Clearly there's a relationship over the top, overarching, then there's a hierarchy of organisations, they drop down. How is your understanding of the relationships with junior officers, particularly more out there operationally? How does that fit together out on the streets? Could you touch upon that? We will have detail later about certain parts of the services, but how does that work when you go further down the chain?
So I think when you go further down the chain, to give you an example, the city, of course, are the ring in the middle of the donut of London, and we're surrounded by a number of Met boroughs. We work with, for example, all of the neighbourhood policing teams within those boroughs on our borders daily. We have joint units, as Chris has mentioned already, so within the economic crime world, within the safeguarding world, within mental health and community and partnership. Command and collaboration, firearms I think is a good area to touch on. So the delivery of firearms operations across 3 forces daily, we trust our command at probably inspector level for the resolution of those incidents, and they work together daily on some very, very high risk areas of business. But I think the important point to note is they've all had the same training to the same standard, are accredited to the same standard, and are completely interoperable. One of the benefits of the very extensive exercising and testing calendar that exists between the 3 forces is the fact that our colleagues, to whom I'm referring, work together throughout the year in exercising and testing for a whole range of scenarios, whether it's major incident, natural disaster or counter-terrorism. They get to know each other and relationships are formed. So I think, just to give you a flavour, further down the chain, there are very good personal relationships and tactical relationships.
So if I might say, Chair, we take firearms as an excellent example, but I don't think it's that different from anywhere else. You know, we provide the training, the standards are set nationally. Our officers work with the same kit, same equipment, same tactics. They're on the same radio system. And they go in and out of each other's areas quite contentedly. And whoever is in charge is in charge. It doesn't matter whether it's a sergeant from the city or an inspector from the Met, or where it is happening. If it needs resolving, they work together. Go to a football match, as I did last week at West Ham. You find a city commander. You find quarter of the resources come from the city. They're working completely interoperably out at Stratford with my teams, and that it's just second nature to all of them. They don't see a difference, if you like.
Pleased to learn I was looked after last night by all those services when I went to the West Ham Palace game. But one point around this is, and we will touch upon the consistency of operational service on other issues later, is probably also the challenge side, because we've obviously heard quite properly descriptions of this is something we do well together. At senior level, there's consistency and trust. Could you, and we may explore again examples later, but could you give us some ideas around where actually it isn't always that easy, and the kind of challenges that you might find at a decision strategic level?
But perhaps I could give some examples where I think they are they're challenges, but actually the way that we operate together largely overcomes those challenges. So in my particular circumstances, and you take anywhere in London, you have trains and services which are coming into London and are potentially importing challenges into the capital. You could look at that from a mental health perspective, you could look at it from travelling criminals perspective. And one of our, I suppose, challenges, as we are an organisation looking at transient population, some 1.3 billion passengers on the London Tube each year, is how we then interact with borough-based resources. So whether it's the police or whether it's local authorities and other structures that deal with things on a geographical basis. So one of my challenges, I guess, is how do we engage with those processes. What I think we could take comfort from is I have sort of locally based commanders who operate really closely with the borough resources and the other local authority resources and other agencies within that borough area to resolve issues. And often we bring new information to those structures that they wouldn't otherwise have because of the transient nature of some of the people that are coming in. So it's an interesting additional layer to address, but I think largely the processes work because of those really close working relationships and the ability for people to identify who is the best organisation to deal with it. So we could be dealing with a safeguarding issue, but actually the person is either a resident in a borough or there are linkages already in place dealing with that individual, and there's a seamless handover for the right organisation to deal with that individual.
That is the nature of your officer's demands and challenges, is because, as you say, some problems will be imported and exported across boundary, and they have to deal with that, and that's a particular challenge that you and your officers got. But is there, again, difficult issues across, for example, the City of London with the Met at strategic level that you want to work together, you are working together, but is more difficult than others?
I think where we can identify opportunities to collaborate, we're onto them fairly quickly. I suppose as a city officer and the force responsible for economic crime nationally, there's certainly, in terms of economic crime, some more work we can do as a Triforce initiative around dealing with fraud. It's the fastest growing crime type in the country, we know that. We're not going to be able to arrest our way out of it, for example. Enforcement-wise, the volume is just too much. But certainly in terms of prevention, education, awareness campaigns, it's certainly an area for us that we are looking across the three forces to do more of. So it's an example of having identified a collaboration opportunity. We're actively working to make sure that happens. So I think we'll always pick stuff up, and we're all very good at debriefing, organisational learning, and we share that as well. So there was an opportunity through organisational learning forums that three forces have to make improvements for areas that need improving.
Clearly, economic crime is an area that your force leads on nationally. We understand that, and we'll be talking about that later. But one thing I'd like to explore is about priorities. The Met has priorities through the Mayor's London Plan that the Cressida and her senior officers will deliver, or aim to deliver. You colleagues may have different centrally set priorities, potentially, that may be in friction and in contrast with those of the Met and others. Does that ever become an issue vis-à-vis priorities?
From a city perspective,
and in the centre, but it's a question I need to pose.
Of course. From a London perspective, I think if you look at the City of London priorities, and for example, sitting at the top of our list is counter-terrorism. It's obviously a shared responsibility. The Met lead on counter-terrorism, but it's a shared priority for London, and we work together on that. Very topical, violent crime, serious violence. Again, it's a priority for the city. We work with the Met seamlessly across boundaries, across boroughs, to deal with that. Safeguarding and vulnerable people, again, a mayoral priority, a Met priority, BTP priority. So there are mostly, I would suggest, the priorities of the forces are shared. There will be some unique priorities. So for us, as you know, economic crime, cyber-enabled crime. But again, the processes are in place across three forces to work together in those areas. So when I look across the policing priorities for the three forces, I would suggest they're probably fairly reflective of the needs of Londoners.
The headline, I think we're having the volume turned up a bit. I do apologise. We all agree, and we get to those subject matters later around terrorism, fraud, safeguarding, that are clearly Londoners' priorities, and we share all of those. But I'm trying to explore whether they are contrasting priorities. We'll talk about financial challenges later and how those can affect the way that one works together, because I think one of our forces here amongst us is increasing our numbers, I think that's yourself, where others are potentially reducing. We can explore that a little bit later. And that leads me on really to talking about financial aspects and benefits of the partnership, if I may use that word, and relationship. Looking over the coming 2, 3, 4 years, will there be, and do you discuss this and work towards these financial benefits through the three forces working together?
We do, and we will. I do think the thing that drives us most is the desire to have the best service for people in London, whether they are, London residents or not. Working together helps us to manage our collective demand better, of course, as well. We are constantly seeking ways of sort of reducing any duplication. I don't think there's much, but we want to do that. And on occasion, there are clear sort of financial benefits which come, for example, from our different scale. So we have several examples of where the Met's buying power, if I can put it that way, has been useful for colleagues. It would not make any sense, I think, for the city to have its own first contact team, the people who take the 999 and 101 calls. We've provided that service for some considerable time. That's gives us greater scale. It's very effective, and I like to think you get a value for money thing from that. I could take it to a micro point. We house on occasion your dogs, don't we, Paul? Down at Kester, rather than them for having in their own kennels. It's a tiny point, but we're always thinking about things like this. Training is an important one for us. So for the City of London, I think I'm right in saying we provide the Senior Investigating Officer training, management of violent and sexual offenders, the pursuit training, the TPAC training you'll have heard about, investigative interviewing and analysis.
A whole host of ways.
Many, and similarly for
the fact, I mean, we're all facing financial challenges. Oh, yeah, what's going on here? Yeah. And you have targets to save considerable amounts of money. Are you factoring this work together? So you're looking at ways jointly you can improve services but also save money?
Absolutely. So we're all talking at the moment about how, with our respective governance bodies, how we can make more of our estates. And there are room, I'm sure, in the estates futures, which are always big, as 5-10 years sort of futures. There's room for us to collaborate with our new builds and that kind of thing very helpfully, and we're certainly exploring that.
My last point before I bring my colleagues in is around the holding to account. Now, clearly, Cressida, you enjoy the experience of being held to account by the Mayor of Mopac and by extension this committee, and we have a structure there. Paul and Alistair, you have different ways that you're held particularly to account. Could you briefly summarise that for the benefit of colleagues, how that works?
So we have a police authority based largely on the structure of the former police authorities within geographic forces. They are, they've of course got a national remit, and they are representative of a range of stakeholders who have an interest in transport. So by statute, they're required to have representatives who have an interest in the travelling public's views. There are people who have knowledge of the interests of people who work on the railway, who of course are subject to crime in their own right. People who represent the regions, and there are some people who represent the interests of our funders. So we have a unique funding regime, as you'll know. So our police authority independently sets the budget, indeed, and that is then levied against the operators of the services. And so we have I would say, a very strong holding to account regime. Sometimes I look at it and I wonder whether it's actually stronger than some geographic forces might have. It's regular, it's consistent, it brings together people from the public and the private sector, it brings a very strong commercial element to it, it drives very hard around value for money and outcomes, and whilst and all the individuals on it are appointed through the public appointments arrangements and approved by the Secretary of State. So there's the link back into parliamentary scrutiny.
Alistair, you have a city committee of grandees, no doubt, that hold you to account. Do you want to talk about that?
Chair. So the police authority for the City of London is the Court of Common Council, which is the body that governs the City of London. They provide delegated authority to the City of London Police Committee, who consist of elected members from the court. The Police Committee meets 8 times a year to hold the Commissioner to account. And sitting below Police Committee are various other scrutiny committees, similar to current arrangements in the Met, Finance, Audit, Risk, etc. So reflective, I think, of a mix of both British Transport Police and Met committees, but there's a very, very strong governance and accountability regime within the city.
Very much. Andrew, do you want
to... it's coming up to one of the things that Paul's been sort of going around. I just wanted particularly to look at the relationship with TfL. And could you explain how you decide the process, how you decide how many officers we need on the London Transport Network to keep the public safe?
So I could talk to you for probably most of the afternoon around the charging model and the resourcing model. It's pretty complicated. We have a different set of arrangements with different operators. So those that you might call, if you like, the train operating community are required by statute to have a police service agreement and required to have it with us. TfL have a mixture of arrangements. Some of them fall under that arrangement, some of them are around, particularly around the policing of the tube, and we agree a level of service with TfL for what they're looking for, and we resource it accordingly. Actually, there's a determined number of officers within the police service agreement we have with TfL for which they pay.
So how many officers are in the agreement, and how many vacancies?
I haven't got that detail directly to hand, but I could let you have that if that's helpful.
And TfL don't pay for the vacancies, presumably?
They don't. TfL have enjoy, I think, a relationship that others would aspire to, where they pay precisely for what they get.
Okay. Caroline?
In our background page here, it says that British Transport Police covers the Underground, the DLR and Emirates Airline. How strenuous is it to police the Emirates Airline?
When it's windy, it's not...
customers. Sorry.
When it's windy, it's not the most popular patrol, I can tell you. Yeah,
I mean, that's a small amount of it. I mean,
Indeed. But of course, it's very close to the DLR. So many of the people who come from the DLR then use that route, and some of the rules and procedures that apply to that apply equally to the transport system. So it's kind of a natural fit. It's not a huge demand on our resources.
do you see that you potentially could look after the buses as well, or do you think that sits best with the Met?
Well, I think it works very well at the moment. I think the Met have a particular specialism they developed on the buses, and what's important is the interface. So where you've got bus terminus that are co-located with rail stations, there's a really good, very close working relationship, sort of joint tasking, joint sharing of information around that. So we're very happy with the area that we're dealing with, and we're very happy that the relationship works. Ultimately, those are political decisions, I guess, around that. But as we say in many areas, providing it's working effectively, I think you need to look hard before you sought to change any of those models.
Where do trams fit with this? Are they part of, is that?
So we police the Croydon tram.
You do the Croydon
Yes.
tram as well?
And of course, just to share a bit of detail around that, much of the Croydon tram network runs on railways. And there are some specific rules and regulations and procedures that apply to railways which are different to the bit where it runs on the road. So in many ways there's a much closer alignment to railway policing for the trams than necessarily there is for buses.
Thank you.
And on that subject, thank you for yourself and your officers with the tragic accident with Croydon tram those months ago. Thank you for coming along there. So the last question on this section before we do move on, I did allude to it slightly earlier about policy on tactics and equipment, and for example, stop and search. So how are, without going into too much specifics, how is that training and policy delivery aligned across the three forces? Because all those forces can deliver equally on certain tactics. How is that, you touched upon the training earlier, how is that aligned tactically, training-wise?
So we all sign up to the best use stop and search programme. We train in exactly the same way. Our teams of policy and training leads talk to each other all the time. In fact, sometimes we're swapping people across from one side to another. A lot of our operations, for example, sector operations that might involve a knife arch, are tri-force operations. So just over the way there was one the other day, at Charing Cross. The BTP officers are there, the city officers are there, we're there, got a knife arch. People who don't want to go through the knife arch may be acting suspiciously. If we have sufficient grounds, somebody is going to end up doing a stop and search. Could be any one of us. And I think we all have the same kind of, we have a dialogue about it. We have the same approach in terms of things like, the Know Your Rights card is a joint tri-service card, the way in which we try to speak with and understand any concerns that our communities may have, very similar. And I don't want to sound complacent about any of this, Chair, but I honestly can say I would have absolutely no hesitation whatsoever in a operational constable from the other two forces doing a stop and search anywhere in London, that they would be doing it in exactly the manner that the Commissioner of the Met would expect from their own office.
So that experience from Londoners receiving the services of the tri-services would feel pretty much the same, broadly speaking.
So Chair, the training and procedures around stop and search are consistent across policing. I think an interesting added element is my deputy, Adrian Handstock, is the National Police Chief's lead for stop and search. Adrian was in the Met. He used to work closely with Craig Mackey when Craig was the lead for stop and search. So the collective view on the tactical deployment of stop and search, I think, is a very much a shared set of values. You will see stop and search being applied by officers from the Met, the City and BTP alongside each other on a day-to-day basis. If you went to Stratford today, you would see a joint operation around SEPTA, and they're working all over London in the same way, using the same approach. And I share the Commissioner's view that you wouldn't see any difference in the approach.
The tri-services card, so there's almost, in some elements operationally, almost a tri-services brand almost, an acceptance that there's a three parties working together.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, perhaps the most sort of evocative example of that is that our mutual determination straight after the ghastly attacks of last year that we would have a tri-service commendation ceremony and all certificates assigned by the three chiefs. We work interoperably, we are part of protecting London.
We'll take this nice on to the next section. Andrew's got a brief
well,
question.
just a small, I mean, you painted a picture of a very close collaboration, and just wondering, are your officers on the same pay rates, terms and conditions, or do they vary?
The conditions of service are the same.
And the pay rate is the same?
Yes.
Andrew, I was distracted. I do apologise. Andrew, oh, that's it. Well, Sean's got a question. Why don't you ask it?
Just very quickly on body-worn video, because that's something that the Met is rolling out. Where are the other two forces on that?
I think it's a fantastic example of everything the Commissioner was describing. So, as the Met was running the pilot, body-worn video, we joined the pilot. We took advantage of the purchasing power of the Metropolitan Police. We've bought the same cameras, the same back office function, and it's identical. So we are in the process of rolling out 2,000 body-worn cameras right at this very moment. So some officers in London have got them, not everyone yet. But that's a rapid rollout process with exactly the same kit.
So for the City of London, excuse me, exactly the same position. All of our frontline officers, response officers, neighbourhood officers, firearms officers now wear body-worn video, and we're currently in the process of rolling that out further into the force in terms of CRD support, for example, investigators. But we're in exactly the same position as the Met and BTP in that respect.
That's good, so that anyone stopped and searched would have the same level of accountability no matter which force it was. Correct.
Okay, that's good, thank you. Okay, that was good, asking some strategic questions. We're going to move to some subject areas now, about priority areas. And this leads us into the priority area which Caroline's going to lead on, terrorism and extremism.
Thank you very much. Well, you've already mentioned the horrible events last year and the wide praise that the forces had received for how you worked together. I just wanted for you to give me an outline of how you actually work together to prepare for such attacks and such potentially diverse attacks, and how you keep on top of that.
So sadly, as you know, we have quite a long history in the city over generations, and as long as I've been a police officer, we've worked quite closely on counter-terrorism. You'll be aware of the Met's role in terms of the Assistant Commissioner and the National Counter-Terrorist arrangements being led from the Met. We have City and BTP officers seconded into the Met in various different parts of our SO15, for example, National Terrorist Finance Unit. I could go on, but many of them. Your question goes particularly, I think, to the protect and prepare area. So every fortnight, and sometimes more often, depending on what is going on, the Security Review Committee sits. and that sets the protective security posture for London from a police point of view and beyond. And the city and BTP are a very integral part of that process. There is also a national protect and prepare group, again, all three heavily engaged in that. So our protect and prepare people are meeting and talking in high level and more tactical arrangements all the time. When it comes to training and exercising, which Alistair talked about, we do all have some small areas of our own training and exercising, but frankly they're very small and they're always done in the same way and to the same standards as each other. The vast majority of both our training and our exercising is done across the three, and of course with other emergency service or other partners frequently. We've mentioned firearms already, so things like firearms, things like negotiators, things like public order, these are all national standards. We all train to the same level and are completely interoperable, which means that when the call comes in, you may very well have, and we did have in these major incidents last year, what we call a silver commander who comes from BTP, as was the case, I believe, at Parsons Green, working under a Met command structure overall, and a mixture of officers responding in the first response, both firearms and otherwise. Cordons might be delivered by the city or by a city commander at least, as they were around here for those terrible days after London Bridge. And certain services are just sort of always supplied by the Met. So, for example, explosives, ordnance, people who respond to a package, a bomb, they are provided by the Met for everybody, but again, the city are embedded in there. When it comes to things like Casualty Bureau, Family Liaison, Disaster Victim Identification, again, all to the same standard, interoperable. The city provide a lot of Casualty Bureau support for us, and you look at Grenfell, our DVI teams were city, BTP and Met teams. So through London Resilience and through the national arrangements on counter-terrorism, I think we are constantly learning, we're constantly improving, but we are fully interoperable in every way.
All the policies, procedures, everything is so lined up that there's no issue whoever takes the lead.
Absolutely.
And at your fortnightly security and review committees and some of the other meetings you mentioned, does sometimes one force come along and say, we're picking this up? Is there something more training, something that we should share? Are you able to give any sort of example of where you're all upping each other's game, as it were?
Certainly. So if I give you an example of the awful incidents that we saw in 2017 through terrorism and natural disaster, all of those will have had a debrief, and the majority of those have been conducted at the three levels: strategic, tactical and operational. Those debriefs are jointly reviewed by the three services, and then there will be working groups to make sure that the improvements that are needed potentially in any area are implemented together. Just to give you an example of the scale of the exercising and testing that goes on. So for this year, for 2018, before I came out here today, I looked, there's around 32 scheduled exercises tri-force throughout the year dealing with CT incidents, major disasters, natural disasters, that all three forces will be involved in and implementing learning from the previous incidents that we've dealt with. So I think for us, exercising and testing is absolutely critical, and I think that the responses that we saw last year are testimonies to the success actually of that schedule. So
that's a huge number of exercises. 32, I realise it's all different sorts, but that is...
That's not new. I mean, we've invested in this over many years, really, well, consistently, but certainly since 2005 we've been investing at a high level in our testing and exercising. And these terrible events, again, I don't want to sound complacent about it, but as you said, we did receive a great deal of praise as a city for the resilience we all showed and the ability to respond to those incidents, and that is because of the continuous learning and the continuous testing and exercising. We know each other.
In terms of British Transport Police, because as you say, you're a national force, are there things that you're doing in other parts of the country that you think perhaps we ought to be doing in London?
Well, I think, so we touched on the Security Review Committee, and and actually that's a national structure. So that sits weekly, and there are people involved in that from right across the country. It's chaired by a DAC, from the Deputy Assistant Commissioner from the Met. So actually what that is getting is input from right across the country around what's happening, who's doing what. It doesn't just sit in extremis. You know, when we've had a sort of a London Bridge or a Manchester, it sits every week, and it's looking at trends, it's looking at what's happening abroad, it's looking at what is happening here. And then agreements are reached within that meeting. And just to give you a flavour, following the SRC, my attendees come back to BTP, and then we hold an internal version of it, where we then disseminate the actions that we've agreed nationally that we're going to do. Often that's in London, but equally that can be outside of London, working with other forces. So it's a very effective, strategic yet tactical means of making sure that everybody's pursuing the same activities.
The other side of all of this is preventing extremism, and we know a reasonable amount about what the Met is doing in approaching that. Can you both outline, perhaps starting with you, Paul, what your work is in this prevent area?
So we work very closely with the counter-terrorism network across the UK, as well as with the Met. Clearly we don't have a residential population, and so a lot of the activities in that respect, in terms of the wider prevent strategy, we have a supporting role in many of those elements. Clearly people are moving around the transport system between those communities, and so we are constantly linked into what's being done elsewhere. Clearly, without going into too much detail, we're also looking at I guess insider threat and some of those sort of elements that you would expect us to look at in the whole prevent arena, but it's slightly different, I think, because there's not a geographically residential population.
What for you, Alistair?
Within the city, we have our own prevent action plan, but we're very closely aligned with the Met. You'll be aware that we have a very limited residential population, so around 10,000 people live in the city. Around 450,000 come in every day, so transient population, and therefore the majority of our work sits alongside the work that the Met does. We deal with referrals, we give referrals both ways. So again, for us, it's very closely working with the Met.
So you've both got slightly very different roles, because you don't have that huge residential population, as it were, but your approaches to preventing extremism are again all aligned. There's nothing different apart from Paul's, particularly yours is very transient. Okay. What information sharing would take place when you identify within one of your forces a person of interest?
It would be the same, actually, as in any force. It comes under the national sort of counter-terrorism arrangements, and as you're aware, sharing information is absolutely fundamental, and is also, I think, sort of well enabled by both the structures, the cultures, and the sort of technology. We work very closely together on every aspect, but if we took something like terrorist finance, you know, the City of London have a particular expertise in financial crime, so something might come into them from a bank or something like that, which would be of relevance for us from a terrorist point of view, and the teams are working together. In fact, they have members in each side, so Met people sitting in their team and vice versa all the time. The Fraud Intelligence Bureau also often receives information which is relevant to terrorism, and the analysts meet regularly from terrorist finance and fraud intelligence to make sure that we're matching across. So I would describe it as exactly the same as CT information sharing across the country, except the fact of the matter is we're so closely aligned and geographically sort of located together that it's, where it just takes somebody to walk down the corridor to speed something up, that's even easier.
And in terms of the London Contest Board,
yeah.
How are your roles, what's each force's role within the London Contest Board?
We, we all attend and contribute to each of the strands of contest in that respect. I think it's much along the lines that Cressida was just describing, how we share information and look at what contribution we've individually got to on each of the individual strands from that. So I think the structures are in place, all the relationships are in place, and the information sharing is in place to facilitate that.
ETP, you have a place on the contest board, do you?
I think I just need to check whether it's a permanent place, but we're certainly linked into that group.
What
Likewise. I think I'll go back and check. But in terms of the contest plan within Force and the 4Ps, that's certainly shared at contest board and across London. So in terms of information sharing, intelligence sharing, that's well tied up within the plans that we review together across the contest.
Because on my limited research, I wasn't sure about BTP, but city police aren't routinely there, but the corporation is.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's a slightly unusual arrangement in any case in the city, but I'd have thought you would want to be at the table at something like that as well. So
The local authorities, so the City London Corporation, have the prevent lead in the city, and it's their
so
representative.
that would be why they would be there, but they then would link back to you.
Correct, into our superintendent from Community and Partnerships.
And so would we, because there is a sort of sense in which I think you would be comfortable with this, the sense that, you know, the Met is hosting the national arrangements. The Met has an enormous capability, and we take that on for our colleagues wherever it is appropriate, but we will always report back.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Great, Joanne.
Just a quick question, that's particularly in this area about counter-terrorism and the money that goes into it. Do you jointly get together and make a joint case for London to government, or do you very separately make your own case?
First of all, we work through National Counter-Terrorism Policing Headquarters around the bidding process, and there is a huge degree of consultation across the three forces around the individual needs of forces and of course the joint needs of Londoners. So the bids to government and funding are joint bids done in consultation. So therefore the money that comes back the other way is divided between the forces against individual strategic threat and risk. And there are numerous examples of that throughout the year where we are receiving grant funding through NCTPHQ hosted by the Met.
It's the needs of London as a whole that
Yes.
is catered for?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a difference in my case,
Yeah.
actually. We don't receive any of the CT grant funding. So it is it's a bid that's put together by the Home Office and the services, Home Office forces and the CT structure. The budget that I have to expend on CT activity comes through our standard budget. So, for example, as we took a decision after Manchester and London Bridge, something we've been working on for about a year, to increase our CT footprint outside of London in some other hubs. I don't get funding from the CT grant for that. I have to make a separate bid through my police authority for that funding.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we leave that subject, I'd like on behalf of the committee to thank all the three services for what you do working together in keeping some Londoners safe, particularly around terrorism. Now, we touched on fraud and economic crime. Sorry, Andrew, I didn't see your signal.
Yes, sorry.
I don't normally miss you, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, never mind. I just wanted to follow up on the Mayor's announcement just before Christmas that he's going to consult on a new counter-extremism, countering violent extremism programme, and I wondered what each of your contributions, or how you'll be contributing to that, will be. What role do you expect to play in that?
So it's early days. We know certainly the Met, we're very pleased to know that he is going to do this. We're eager, and I know that colleagues at City Hall are equally eager to ensure that whatever it is, it complements the current existing arrangements, whether those are the national government ones or partnership arrangements in London, and I'm confident that that will happen. We are looking forward to, you know, a strategy for London led by him around how we prevent people becoming violent extremists, how we help support communities that may be particularly vulnerable to violent extremism. I think it's very early days. I don't know, I mean, my colleagues may want to jump in here, but I think it's pretty early days to ask them what they would be doing about it, because we don't quite yet know exactly how it's going to shape up. But I hope you have seen, you know, that genuinely we are joined at the hip. We have different accountabilities, we have different communities to some extent, but we see the world very similarly, and I think you know, just as we have collaborated on prevent, we will be collaborating with this work.
Okay, that answers your question. Yes, no?
I don't think the two understand.
I think, Professor, possibly.
I think we would see the Met as the lead organisation in this, and we would be supporting the Met. Sorry, Professor, if that's okay.
No, fine.
But I think there's the natural link through the sort of the geographic community, and we would be providing the support through the structures we've already described into that approach.
I think from the city perspective, I've sort of described the demographics of the city and the current structures and approach that we have, again, from the existing CT structures within Force and community and partnership structures, then we would be supporting the London position quite keenly.
Okay. As a committee, we continue to scrutinise it as it develops. Okay, moving on. We mentioned already the lead role that the city takes in fraud and economic crime in London. Now we've specifically got some questions around that. Sean?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've asked these primarily to the City of London Police. You're the policing lead for economic crime. You said just now that fraud is also one of the most the crimes that's increasing. You run a number of different sort of departments within the City of London Police as part of being the national lead. I've got down here card and payment crime, the Economic Crime Academy, the Insurance Fraud Enforcement Department, the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, the Intellectual Property Crime Unit. I think you also run Action Fraud, which is the reporting. So can you just tell us how well integrated that is with sort of regular policing and the Met? And is there anything you think should be changed about the way it works?
Okay, if you're all right, I'll just give you some sort of context around the volume of crime that the city deal with in terms of economic crime, particularly fraud. So we do host the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, or Action Fraud as it's known, that takes reports of fraud. Currently receives around 500,000 reports a year through our contact centre, but also through referrals from financial bodies.
Can you repeat that number? Sorry, there was a...
500,000
500,000
through Action Fraud. Those reports are assessed by teams of trained detectives and police staff members to look at whether there are viable investigative leads within those cases that are referred to them. And then once that's done, we will look at the threshold of the crime, for example. Is it something that should be referred to the Serious Fraud Office, the NCA? Where it's cross-force, cross-boundary, multi-jurisdictional, we, the City of London Police, will normally take that investigation. Last year, we made 127,000 referrals to forces up and down the countries to investigate. So a significant number of crimes that we said had some leads that we need to follow up. So the volume is huge, and of course, fraud still comes in through many other routes, through local reporting to police stations or through businesses.
How many of those reports go to the Met? So the investigations, how many do you pass to the Met?
I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but obviously the Met are the biggest recipient of referrals through to Operation Falcon, the unit in the Met, who deal with investigation of economic crime within the Met, and also lead for the London region on the investigation of cybercrime, so hacking, for example. You've referenced a number of the units that exist within the City of London Police Economic Crime Department. So the Economic Crime Academy trains law enforcement officers, local authorities, private bodies to investigate fraud. That is a unit that's been running for, I think, about half a dozen years now, where the demand on it is absolutely huge. So the training output is huge, but of course that's a national training requirement, so it's very well embedded in forces nationally and has those links. We go and deliver training nationally, not just in London, but up and down the country. Some of the other units that you've referenced there, so the dedicated check plastic card payment unit, We have Met officers embedded within the unit there, working with us. We have an economic crime victims of crime unit, which deals with vulnerable victims who have reported crime and who are likely through crime patterns, crime trends to be repeat victims. We also have Met officers embedded there, and those Met officers give us direct access to neighbourhood policing teams, for example, who are able to be tasked and go out to visit vulnerable victims of crime, so potentially elderly victims, very vulnerable victims of crime. So it's very well embedded with local policing across London, and we have these structures in place to make referrals, do home visits, provide crime prevention advice. 98%, in a recent survey, we had 98% of individuals who'd reported fraud through Action Fraud received crime prevention advice, substantive crime prevention advice, either through the Economic Crime Victim Care Unit or through the investigator within their case. So the links are there into local policing directly.
Yes, we've asked about that before. So just to be clear, the investigation will tend to stay with you if it's cross-border. It'll go to the Met if it's local. It tends to be investigated.
Yes.
Is the Met passing it on to local officers to investigate, or is it kept within the central unit within the Met?
Not all kept within the central unit. So the specialist unit at Falcon deals with the majority of referrals and actually is very successful in delivering outcomes in terms of charges, judicial outcomes. But a lot of the cases will go out to borough policing for further investigation by local CID. So there is a thread that comes through, if you like, from the centre, City of London Police, through to neighbourhood policing.
I think we've talked before about education and prevention
Yes.
work, and I think you mentioned it earlier before. Is that something there could be more collaboration on, pushing out prevention advice through borough officers now that they've got more communication tools?
Absolutely. This morning I met with our Director of Communications within the City to talk about the joint work that we need to be doing more of with colleagues from the Met and BTP. And again, I go back to the point, the sheer volume of crime in this arena means that we will not be able to enforce it all, and therefore the focus from policing and government on prevention, that lead needs to be taken, and the awareness campaigns that we'll embark on, the training programmes that we'll embark on should address some of that element, but there's certainly more work to be done in that arena.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to also ask about the statistics that we can get. 'Cause we did an investigation, or not me, because I wasn't on the committee then, but in 2015 this committee did an investigation into online and cybercrime, and did find that there wasn't a good way of getting statistics about online crime. We're still not getting it through the MOPAC dashboard, and so is enough sharing of, monitoring and statistics so that we can see what's going on?
I can certainly ensure that the committee receives the data that you require. Our strategic development unit within economic crime holds the local and national statistics. They are available, so I can get that to you. I think a good statistic that I do like to put out in terms of our investment in fraud investigation, and this goes across the London region. For every pound that we invest in the investigation of economic crime, fraud, there's a return on investment of around £40 in terms of prevention, asset seizure, etc. And that's been fairly consistent over the last few years, but certainly in terms of data and statistics, we can provide those.
Okay, and finally, businesses are obviously victims of online crime as well. Do you have the same statistics for businesses as victims, sort of split out so that we can see, is that rising as much?
We'll certainly have the statistics to be able to provide on private industry, but those are retained. We have very, very good links and forums into private business, as you would expect in the city, but ultimately all of the figures and data will come through Action Fraud, but that can be provided.
Okay, I've one final question, but before I sort of just ask the Met a question about how well integration is going. You mentioned in the briefing here that the intellectual property crime unit, does that interface with borough trading standards officers?
It does indeed.
Yeah.
Intellectual property crime, as it says on the tin, it's about trademark, it's about brands, it's about fraud within that arena. So the intellectual property crime unit is active across a whole number of sectors, and local trading standards, Federation Against Copyright Theft, for example. So all of those bodies we're engaged with. And we have private industry embeds within PIPQ, the International Property Crime Unit, and all of our other units as well.
Officers from the City of London would be the ones liaising with borough trading standards officers about things?
Not necessarily. It's
No.
it's open to local officers, local neighbourhood teams to do the work with trading standards, and they do across London. So there is no limit on that, but we will work with local trading standards. Not just in London, I might add. It's a national remit, so some of the work that we do is national.
Can I ask the Commissioner, how well integrated do you think it is? Are there improvements that could be made, especially around things like where you're improving your dedicated ward officers, for example? Is it easy to get them linked up with online and fraud, economic crimes like that?
I think it's not perfect, which isn't any reflection on our force relationships. It's just that we have, as you know, an awful lot of different things on our plates, and the skills required to deal really effectively with crime in the online world are developing all the time, and our people are having to try to, get upskilled all the time. And I'd be lying if I said I thought we were absolutely where we need to be, and even when we get there, the world will have moved on again. But we do have very good access, we have very good relationships, we have very good technology that helps us. And at the higher end, there are, I won't bore you with them, but at the higher end of fraud, for example, where we're dealing with serious organised crime, then again, most of the units that are relevant, for example, the asset confiscation unit or the unit that deal with protected persons, all these things are these are joint units where we have absolutely, the Met takes the lead, but the units are joint. And that allows, sitting in our intelligence bureau, a seamless join up between our forces. But no, the challenge of online crime and cybercrime is huge, as Alistair has said, and we've got a long way to go.
The reason I focus quite a lot of my questions on local officers is because, and I think we've discussed this before, how the way that online crime is essentially replacing what used to be doorstep crime is people. It's not particularly technical, it's people being deceived, but they're being deceived over email and by websites and things into giving away their money. And do you think it's still appropriate that crimes of that kind are kept in the specialist unit, or might they be better tackled and reported through normal mechanisms, because they're more like a normal crime, if that makes sense?
Okay, I think if I can just refer back to the Policing Vision 2025, National Police Chiefs Council, Vision for Policing. One of the areas of focus in there is upskilling the workforce for the new challenges that policing will face, and all forces in the country are signed up to this, and therefore the recognition within strategic workforce plans for each force or each region includes for the future the upskilling of officers to be able to deal with online crime. 70% of the fraud that is reported in this country is online, i.e. cyber enabled. So evidence capture at initial point of reporting is absolutely key, so we need to make sure that our neighbourhood officers and frontline officers are trained in that arena. That said, I go back to the prevention element of where we need to focus. There's some great work going on between the London forces with some independent bodies. The Global Cyber Alliance is a body, a non-profit making organisation that the City of London are partners in, who are a group of innovators who will design online tools for members of the public to prevent fraud, whether it's phishing emails or hacking. These are free tools that are put out to the public. So there's an area, for example, that we need to raise awareness in through local neighbourhood officers, through crime prevention advice, where they can go out to victims of crime, or even before they become victims of crime, to provide them the details of some of the free tools that are available. So there's some really good work going on in the fraud and local policing arena, but again, we need to raise the awareness around those issues.
I think it's a fair question, because those of us that, for example, sit on wall panels and local people are asked to set local priorities, often those priorities are around fraud and economic crime, and local officers need to understand how they respond and how they deal with that.
I think we absolutely all agree with that. I think, though, also we would also all agree, I think, that we have the National Cybersecurity Centre, we have the government strategy. It is not at all infrequent for the you know, the victims of a fraudster to live in 5 or 10 different force areas, and perhaps the a person who is carrying out the fraud to be in another jurisdiction. These are complicated things for policing and the national arrangements to work with.
It could be a local crime with local victims, but
Could be.
the perpetrators could be
Exactly.
wheresoever. Right, Unmesh, you wanted to come in?
Yes, Chair, thank you. Assistant Commissioner, there's no doubt you do excellent work in the area of fraud and economic crime. But can I ask you about other types of crime in the city? What sort of other crimes are reported to you and in what volume? After all, there are 7 to 8,000 residents in the City of London. And I know that just last week we had 2 moped-related crime incidents in Silk Lane, because I also represent the City of London on the authority, and I think it's on the front page of City Matters. But can you just give this committee an idea of other types of crime that you deal with, and particularly what volumes? I don't expect you to tell the exact figures here.
Okay. So London is borderless. We might be the City of London, but it's an invisible border. We're aware of that. We're not immune from all of the crime types that affect the rest of the Met and British Transport Police on the railways. So some concerns for us at the moment around crime are, as per the rest of London, moped-enabled crime, where we're seeing an increase in robberies by youths on mopeds coming through the city. Theft persons, so we're again cycle crime, where they're not using mopeds, they're coming into the city to commit snatches on cycles. That's seen a massive increase this year. In fact, those 2 types of offences, moped-enabled crime, robberies and snatches on bikes, account for just about the whole of our crime rise.
Account for?
Sorry?
Does it account for? Can you repeat what you just said?
Sorry, yes. The moped-enabled crime and the pedal cycle snatches that are occurring account for just about the whole of our increase in crime rises in the city this year. So it's a huge focus for us, but the joint work we're doing with the Met and British Transport Police through Operation Gondola, for example, which is the most recent operation that we're running. There are officers from the 3 forces out today combating this type of crime. So we're not immune to those types. Violent crime, again, we have a huge nighttime economy in the city. It's grown massively over the last 4 to 5 years. There are in the region of 800 plus licensed premises in the square mile, 1.2 square miles at the moment. So licensed premises in the city attract with it their own challenges, and therefore the nighttime economy and violent crime and social behaviour is a concern for us. Acquisitive crime overall, we know that the city is an affluent environment and it attracts criminals. All of our persistent and problem offenders are from the Met, unfortunately.
I was waiting for this moment.
It's taken an hour and 10. So.
Who live in the surrounding boroughs and travel from further afield. So we are very aligned to Met boroughs in terms of dealing with our PPOs. So we're not immune to any of the types of crime that you see elsewhere in London. Fortunately, at the moment, we have not yet reached levels of gun crime, for example, that affect some of the London boroughs. But again, it's a similar picture across London.
I mean, in terms of other sort of crimes like burglaries and...
Yeah, so we don't have the residential population, therefore residential burglary will not be on the same scale as the rest of London. But because of the businesses that we have within the city, I think it's around 20,000 businesses, we do have a lot of crime targeted at businesses. So non-residential burglary, walk-in burglaries to steal laptops, items, phones, is a challenge for us. So again, I think the demographics dictate some of the crime that we face.
Caroline?
The example you gave earlier, Alistair, about someone who's vulnerable, become a victim of online fraud or whatever, you getting that through to a local safer neighbourhood team in the Met so that the local team can give advice. Is that routinely done or just exceptionally? Because that, to me, sounds exactly what the local safer neighbourhood teams should be doing.
It is routinely done, and the Economic Crime Victim Care Unit has a very high success rate in terms of stopping repeat offending. And of the percentage of victims that we engaged with last year, it was around 98-99% had not been repeat victims. A lot of the work, crime prevention advice that's delivered is delivered, well there's 3 tiers of advice that's provided, but the majority of it is provided through local neighbourhood policing, not just in London but up and down the country. So it is a success story. The Victim Care Unit is being rolled out now in 2 other forces, so in West Midlands and in Manchester, as pilots, and if that proves successful we hope that through funding, which is provided through here, I might add, we received some funding from MOPAC for that will go national.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And just in terms of all of this area of crime, cybercrime. Have you as a force met yet with the Mayor's Chief Digital Officer looking at tackling fraud and cybercrime?
I haven't personally. I don't know if my senior colleagues have, but I have a commander who's in charge of economic crime nationally. It's a national role. I'd be very surprised if they haven't, but I haven't personally covered.
Thank you.
Yes, just a factual question, really, Alistair. You said that the city is borderless. I see what you mean, but if we had to pin you down, where roughly do you actually go out to east-wise in terms of your, as it were, your area, your beat?
So we go out beyond Bishopsgate to Aldgate, so the borders around my old hunting ground, or my old place, which was Lehman Street at CO19, if you know that area. So we go out east to that point. I say we're not borderless. Well, clearly we're not. We have the ring of steel. So if you still come into the city by vehicle, you'll still see checkpoints in the city that we man occasionally during CT operations. But we've moved on from having the fixed points within the city now, entering the city. So we attract the same sort of criminality that you see across the rest of London.
The reason I'm asking is that there's a method to it, in the sense that, you know, if you're dealing with economic cyber crime, etc., I wonder whether in fact you should take in Canary Wharf. I mean, it's all part of the city, isn't it?
Canary Wharf, yeah, absolutely. So crime would still be reported through Action Fraud. So we would expect to receive reports from Canary Wharf into Action Fraud. So I've no doubt that fraud crime that's committed in Canary Wharf is reported to us. It will go through the same assessment process as any other crime type and be potentially given back to the Met to investigate or retained within the city. So we have a relationship with Canary Wharf, both in terms of economic crime but also in exercising and testing. In fact, the last big exercise that the three forces did was 2 weeks ago in Canary Wharf. So we've got very good relationships with them.
Right, thank you. The next set of questions, which actually is Peter, is talking about mental health. Clearly this is an issue affecting Londoners and the Met as a very important piece, and particularly with BTP would have an interest around it due to the tragedy of many people with health issues committing suicide around your domain, as it were. So Peter, you've got some questions around that.
Yes, thank you very much. Commissioner, maybe I could start with you. When it comes to the, you know, that we're hearing so much more about the increase in mental health issues, is this actually an issue which crosses boundaries anyway between you? Is it right to be talking about it in this context, is that what I'm saying?
I think it's absolutely right to be talking about it in this context. I think the calls for service, the challenges we face are very similar. We work together very closely and we're happy to talk about that more. But what I would say is that clearly we're talking about a relatively confined geographic space here of London with a huge population, some of it coming and going and some of it relatively static. But much of what we're talking about here is no different actually from, or some of what we're talking about here, and certainly in the realms of mental health, is no different from the Met's relationship with Surrey or Hertfordshire, or no doubt Paul's relationship with North Yorkshire. We are all facing huge increases in the amount of time we're spending dealing with people who are presenting with mental health problems. We're all trying to reduce inappropriate police contact, for example. We're all trying to get the demand to be more rational. We're all working in local partnerships to try to make sure that people who have mental health issues are supported in the best possible way.
Could you just maybe give me an idea, just an example or a scenario where the three of you, the three forces, would work together in an area, in this area of mental health? If you, one particular sort of instance.
Yes. So a really good example, I think, would be in terms of people who are in a mental health crisis, who perhaps might be inclined towards self-harm. Sadly, many people take their life on our railways, some 320 people a year across the network. We do an enormous amount of work to identify people who are at risk some preventative sort of analytical work to identify people at risk. But actually, the care of those people and the treatment and the help that those people need will be delivered through local structures, local authorities. We're liaising with local forces. We're closely linked into multi-agency safeguarding hubs, not just across London but across the country, to make sure that where one force identifies someone with needs, then they're linking in with the appropriate agencies, police or otherwise, to make sure that happens. So there's an enormous amount of that going on at any one time. I could give you examples of hotspot locations that we've identified where you get a cluster of suicides, for example. Sometimes there are some particular demographics around people who are involved in that cluster, and then we would work closely with partners like the rail industry, for example, but also local authorities, local police forces, and safeguarding hubs to intervene and work with communities and make communities aware of some of the help and support that's available to them. And that involves all of the agencies, all of the forces, wherever that might work. So dealing with mental health, or indeed vulnerable people, if you take that wider collective description of vulnerable people, involves day-to-day collaborative work right across London. It's going on now as we're sitting here. It's an everyday occurrence. We find that, and I'm sure other forces are the same, dealing with vulnerable people is actually more of a demand on our time in terms of volume and the requirement for resources to be deployed than in fact crime. Crime is so low on the transport system, 16 crimes per million passenger journeys. Actually what we're dealing with an enormous amount of vulnerability, and that involves us working really closely with the Met and the City.
So, so basically the British Transport Police have accrued a fair amount of expertise purely because of the methods people might use to harm themselves, i.e. the transport system, jumping under trains, things like that.
In part, but I think I would broaden it and say this is about vulnerability in the widest sense. I guess if we were to step back and say railway stations by their very nature, transport hubs by their very nature, are usually warm, dry, well lit. Often there are people there and there are services around them. Vulnerable people are attracted to transport hubs. And where you have people who are vulnerable people who are attracted to those locations, you get people who are attracted to potentially prey on vulnerable people. So there's an enormous amount of work day to day that we encounter, and I think we have developed some specific expertise around suicide prevention and doing some sort of preventative work around that. But we share that with others. So I lead a national suicide prevention group. We're linked in with the city. The city and other police forces have locations where people have a tendency to go to if they were going to harm themselves or take their lives. There's lots of tactics and strategic interventions that you can make to try to design those issues out.
Are there any ways in which your work could be strengthened, made easier? I mean, what improvements could there be made in terms of you all interconnecting when it comes to mental health issues like this, or is it working quite well? And
it's less about linkages between police forces and more about linkages with other partners. So one of the challenges we all face is accessing much pressed resources around mental health specialist units. The changes in the law around the detention of people under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act make it not only undesirable, as it's always been, but now unlawful to detain people in police cells who are in need of mental health interventions. And I think we are always working very hard to engage with NHS resources, Public Health England resources, to make sure that there are the appropriate experts that we can pass people on who need specific care. So I think our larger challenge is how we interact with other agencies rather than how we interact with each other.
Oh, I see, right. Okay.
If I can just add, just to Paul's points around other agencies, so there are some good examples of where we have taken steps forward and improved our mental health service provision in policing. So within the city now we have mental health street triage teams. joined up with East London Hackney Health Trusts, who will deal with vulnerable people in the street. And as Paul has said, that will often involve us attending transport hubs, and Liverpool Street is a great example. So there is that joint working thread that runs through mental health across the forces. It's not unusual to have examples of where we have missing persons or vulnerable people reported to the Met, who will travel up on the transport system. British Transport Police will be looking at them, but they'll end up on one of our bridges in the city, London Bridge, Tower Bridge, and the Met Marine Support Unit will fish them out. So fortunately there is that response available across Tri-Service, both in terms of the response to vulnerable people in the street, but also the response to the crisis itself. So it's certainly with the Health Trust there have been steps forward.
When these people gather, maybe as you say, in cafes and warm places and to transport hubs, and we see it everywhere, but obviously we're all aware of this increase in mental health issues. What would you say are the kind of most, say, common problems, common diagnoses of people? You mentioned self-harming people or suicidal people. But where has the increase been? I mean, for example, I was looking here. I mean, even dementia, surely. I mean, with an aging population, even that would come in surely to things you have to deal with, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I was on a borough yesterday morning, doesn't matter where. By lunchtime, I'm glad to say, had found a person who was in his 80s who had actually been out all night and had hit his head, and fortunately was actually found eventually in hospital, but there was a high level of concern about him, and they had had 3 other people in crisis, police the first people to attend, all 3 of whom were threatening suicide. But during the rest of the day, they would fully anticipate potentially dealing with somebody who actually does need, is going to be dealt with under Section 136, not coming to a police cell, but involving police. And for those of our and this would be mainly the Met, I think in fact entirely the Met, where we have a large hospital or an institution, a care institution or another institution which has a lot of people with mental health problems in it, then this is a daily occurrence to be supporting in one way or another the patients. You know that we now have some pretty strict protocols about the times in which we will actually enter, for example, a secure unit to assist the staff. And we're working all the time. This may be something the committee would be interested to delve into on another occasion, as opposed to with the 3 forces present, working all the time to try to make sure that our people are suitably trained, but that they're not doing the work that isn't for the police, and they're not putting themselves or the patient at unnecessary risk by being asked to do something which actually another professional should be doing.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yes, indeed. I mean, in the neighbourhoods particularly, we've increasingly seen the pressures on the neighbourhood teams in dealing with individuals with mental health issues. And clearly, in BTP's world, there's a large amount of those sort of issues there. So we understand that completely. We're moving to the last priority area, which is hate crime and sexual offences. We've been briefed around Project Guardian, a joint initiative, but Andrew, you've got some questions.
Yeah, well, I actually had a question on mental health before I do that for a moment.
Signal a bit better, Andrew, then I might see you.
It's just a question to Paul. The 2013 Victor Adewale report particularly said you were doing good work with the patrols you put together with police officers and NHS psychiatric nurses working together. Perhaps you could say a little bit about that and whether you're still doing it.
Yes, so yes, we are still doing it. Alistair touched on a version that the city are doing, and many forces are doing these street triage approaches. We've got 2 strands to ours. One is a group of mental health practitioners who work in our suicide prevention unit, and are looking at some of the many suicide prevention plans that we're jointly managing with them, and they provide us with a fantastic opportunity to, first of all, advise frontline officers who, of course, are not trained to diagnose different conditions that people might be suffering. And in many ways are often able to say, actually that person is not mentally ill, they have a crisis that needs some other intervention, and we're able to point those people to the right sort of services. Or equally, they're able to, through their own systems, access health information that we would otherwise not be able to access, and then speed up our direction of that person into the right route. So that's a very successful model. We secured sort of match funding from some of the railway industry, from TfL, from Public Health England and from the NHS. It works very well. We've got a version which is very similar to Alistair described, where we've actually got mental health practitioners who go out on patrol with officers and go to locations where we know we come across degrees of vulnerability, and that's proving very successful as well.
Thank you. Well, going on to hate crime and unwanted sexual behaviour, again, a question for you, Paul, just to start off, in that in March 2016 you were going to act your specialist sex crimes unit, and then you reconsidered it, and then you increased it from 12 to 16 people. Is it still 16 people, and is that a temporary increase, or is that permanently how it's going to be?
So, so the reports around what we were going to do with our sexual offences unit were covered extensively in the media. I'm not sure it was always accurate. What was put there?
Well,
what we did is
put the record straight.
Yeah. So what we did is review of how we categorise particular crimes and make sure we've got the people with the right skills investigating the right crimes. What that meant was we were moving away from a particular model of a dedicated team that were dealing with it in a particular way to another enhanced model that would have improved that. It wasn't perfect, and actually on the back of some feedback we got, we looked at it again, and actually we strengthened it further. The numbers of officers that you've quoted are still there. In fact, we've got a significant overlay on top of that. We've got a sexual offences coordination unit that's looking not just in London but across the transport network and trying to identify repeat offenders, trying to actually understand what the drivers are that bring this particular type of offenders to the transport system so that we can do some long-term interventions, and working really hard to get victims to report crimes. It's a massively underreported area of criminality. Sadly, and I strongly disagree with this, many people have said, well, perhaps it's a hazard of travelling on crowded public transport. I don't agree with that for a moment. And what we've been putting a lot of effort into is our Report It to Stop It campaign, to try to get more people to report, particularly using our text system, because it's an ideal and quick way for people to report crimes. That's led to a pretty significant increase in the number of reports that we've had. Personally, I think it's not that there's more sex offending, but it's just that we're hearing about the ones that we didn't hear about before. And we have to constantly look at how we can combat this, because by its very nature, the type of sexual offences we're talking about are those that are committed within crowded carriages. It's a stealth crime where CCTV often can't see, and therefore we need to look at some innovative methods to try to combat it.
And for PTP and the Met again, can you give us an overview on what you've been doing with the Stand Together campaign on hate crime?
So I'll start there. So particularly after the terrorist atrocities, we all carefully monitor increases in hate crime, and sadly we've seen increases around some of those incidents. And together with the Mayor's Office and TfL, we've launched the We Stand Together campaign, and again tried to open up the routes through which people can tell us about offences and offenders that have been taking place. Again, trying to increase the reporting so we can understand where it's taking place. In the transport environment, a high proportion of the hate crime that we record is directed towards rail staff. People are involved in some form of public interaction, often where tickets are involved, etc., and they're subject to some pretty horrible behaviour and verbal attacks from that. So again, the hate crime within our environment tends to be of a particular type and nature, which is probably slightly different than is seen out in sort of geographic areas amongst residential communities. But we work really closely together to make sure that we are sharing information around offenders.
You know, we take this very seriously. We have a kind of strategic group, which being policing, we call a diamond group, and that works with a range of strategic partners to look at how we can better prevent and indeed investigate hate incidents and hate crime. City of London Police and British Transport Police are absolutely integral to that. So we share intelligence, we share analysis, we share assessment of what's going on, and of course on occasion we share offenders and victims, and we most certainly share our best practice and have a kind of joint approach to strategic and local partners.
And how's it going to be evaluated?
What evaluated?
The Stand Together campaign.
Oh,
Good question.
don't know.
I think it's fair to say I'll come back to you on the answer to that. From a city position, just to reiterate what Cressa said really, the sort of joint approach to hate crime reporting, of sharing best practice and actually training. CPD events, so continual professional developments, are shared across the forces, where our practitioners who investigate hate crime, dedicated public protection unit staff, for example, will attend together to review offences, trends, intelligence, and share them in London. So it is another area. I think we've begun the session with a question around how does interoperability and sort of lower ranking relationships work. There's another example of where that is conjoined across forces.
Well, I took that as read from your previous answers, otherwise I'd have asked you specifically about that. But I think if we do have these particular campaigns, it's useful to have some sort of evaluation to see whether they're actually working. I mean, maybe intuitive that they probably would, but I think it's useful to try and work out how we can actually have some objective evaluation of them.
Don't think we're saying we haven't. We're just saying we're ignorant. So I'll come back to you.
I know a couple of others want to come in on this thing, but one thing I know I've raised with Paul before, and the Matt, I don't know how many times, and that's policing football. And I can't really think where else to ask it, although it's not a hate crime. Sometimes it can look that way. Can you give us an indication of how much effort you have to put in BTP into policing football?
Yes. So thank you. So of course it's a huge demand for us each week. I think my last look at this, we spend about £5.5 million on it. I'm trying to think what proportion of that is in London. Quite a big proportion. Obviously, teams are crisscrossing the capital every week. We're trying to see how we can, first of all, manage the demand on our resources, but more importantly, how we could encourage football supporters to behave a bit better on public transport. And some of you may have seen the Dispatches programme that they had a couple of months ago. They spent about a year with us looking at particularly around hate offences and homophobic offences, which made pretty dismal viewing, I have to say. But in many ways that's acted to a degree as a catalyst. I was last week at a meeting at a Premiership football club, who I won't name at this stage, but are very keen to be a leading light in helping us to do something about that. We met with the Football Supporters Federation and from the Kick It Out campaign, as well as the National Football Policing Unit, and talked about how do we change behaviour? How do we say to people that sort of behaviour that might be acceptable on terraces? Don't personally subscribe to that view, but that sort of behaviour that some people think is acceptable in some arenas isn't acceptable on a train when ordinary members of the public are trying to go about their business. And I think there's an emergence, at least, of a view that we could do something about this. And I know you expressed an interest in this before, and I know that the Mayor's interested in it, and actually that could be a useful voice to add to this debate. But I think we have to bring people along with us on this, because we can't enforce our way out of it. I'm deploying around 700 officers every Saturday, crisscrossing the country. I sometimes wonder why that's necessary, to chaperone adults around to go to a sporting event. So we need to look at long-term solutions to it, and I think getting everybody to see that this is something we ought to try to influence and change, I think is the way we'd do it.
And I assume that the football clubs are not coughing up towards your policing costs any more than they are towards the vet.
I think you let that comment stand there, Paul.
Yes, that's the position, the legal position, isn't it not?
Yes.
But I'm sure colleagues have, but if you haven't and you did want to come and look at the policing arrangements for something like a major sporting event, particularly football, you will see really in action the joint working that we're talking about. It's very long established, but their CCTV can come into our control room. As I say, you could have a commander from any of our three forces in charge. It's pan-London because we've got 4 matches in different places. The BTP have a very good knowledge of the vans that they're travelling with. Our spotters know their spotters, their intelligence officers. The whole thing is just, it genuinely is absolutely seamless at every level. But of course, we've been doing it for a long time with football.
And it's also expensive for London taxpayers.
Okay. For the sake of balance, and I would say this, of course, is that those of us that do travel football matches, last night I was on the Jubilee line from the length from Stratford to London Bridge, cheek by jowl with opposing supporters. It's not the 70s or 80s as it was. I take Andrew's point, and I understand his crusade around that, and I think football clubs should commit more. But you know, I want to speak up for the vast majority of peaceable football fans who do go around their pastime without needing your help. Anyway, having said that, Andrew, I've had my say. Tom.
Yeah, well, just
Tom.
in the last season,
We don't want to go back and forth.
West Ham cost the London taxpayers £1 million net policing their games. I think it's outrageous.
Chair, could I
Let's all calm down.
I really have to go in a minute, so can I get my question in?
My point is made, and so is Andrew. Tom, please.
Thank you, Chair. No, so just going back to the hate crime issue, one thing I've been pushing for is a wider campaign against hate crime along the lines of the Report It to Stop It campaign, which was very successful on sexual assault and unwanted sexual attention on transport. Given the success of that, I was wondering what impact you thought a sort of anti-hate crime campaign along the lines of Report It to Stop It could have.
Well, actually, our version of We Stand Together does involve effectively a Report It to Stop It approach. So publicising the text number 61016, and we have definitely seen an increase on both of those campaigns, an increase in the number of texts that we're receiving as a result of that. So it is an integral part of what we do.
Done? Yeah, happy? Sean.
I've got a couple of clearing up points. You've mentioned your text reporting service a couple of times now. It seems to be quite successful. Most of us know the number now. It's been repeated to us often enough. Is that something you'd recommend the Met should have? Because at the moment we're having terrible trouble with 101 as the sort of other way of reporting things. And a text number. I mean, is it simple to use? Is it something that can be rolled out more widely?
Very simple to use.
From your end, I mean, in terms of managing.
So the key to it is there has to be someone on the other end of the text to engage, otherwise it's going into a black hole. And so we've seen, I'm just looking at the volumes, we launched it in January 15, we were getting about 1,000 texts a month. We're currently getting about 6,000 texts a month. And within those will be lots of things that, and this is one of the challenges, I guess, lots of things that aren't necessarily a policing issue. Some of the things are to do with transport and whether the trains are running, and we've got a means by which we hand those off onto other organisations. So actually, it's successful to a degree. We need to look at how we manage larger volumes that could come through that route, so that you don't have a system which is ineffective and doesn't work for the users at the other end. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think you'd need to do quite a bit of evaluation work to say, would this work in a wider context, and where does it fit in relation to 101 and 909? So we often get people who are trying to report emergencies through a text process. That's not what it's designed for. So it's a useful additional channel. I don't think it replaces existing channels.
Let's comment on that, Commissioner. Have you looked into tax?
Just to say, we're
reporting?
really interested in how they're getting on, and as you well know, Sean, we're really trying to open up our means by which the public can contact us. You know, I'm proud of the internet site and the online crime reporting that we're doing. Our telephone and digital investigations unit is going well, and you know, I'm sure, you know, as we look further down the line, that we will develop other ways in which the public can access us that they like, which works. There are always, you know, potential hazards with some of them, as Paul has said on occasions, and the worst thing one can do is to set something up and then not be able to kind of resource it well or make it actually what the customer wants. But you know, without wishing to set hairs running, you only have to see what the NHS are doing with their Babylon thing. You know, the sort of robot talking to people to see that, you know, the next few years we're going to all of us shift hugely in the way we interact with the public.
So going back to, sorry, that's what I meant to ask questions about. Going back to the Report It to Stop It campaign, I'm a big fan of the communications there. It does seem to have increased reporting. Just to ask, can we have some statistics from you on that? And the statistics are held by BTP, because you're the one who's run the website. That would be really useful to know what reports were made during which months and how it coincided with the advertising. That would be really useful to know. And also, is it being used to report sexual assaults and unwanted sexual behaviour that's not on public transport, just because it exists there?
Yes. So TfL published a number on sort of bus stops, etc. And you know, it's not unusual for us to get reports relating to taxis, buses, or other forms of transport. That's not a problem. We've got some processes in place that we can deal with that. So we get a range of reports from different locations. We get some from obviously outside of London, so it's a national structure that we've got. And I think that goes back to my earlier answer, is you've got to make sure that the processes at the other end of it are really, really effective, so you can deal with that and resource them. We respond to quite a lot of texts and get fantastic feedback from people about how that's worked out for them. So our experience is that it's improving. Interesting on the sexual offences reporting, what we found is we get quite a few reports with very little detail. So one of the things we identified in our study is that some people aren't interested in reporting it and pursuing it. I think we've done quite well to say, well, actually, you reporting it helps us to protect other people, so they're reporting it on that basis. But the detail's very scant and leaves it very difficult to actually investigate. So it then goes into an intelligence picture, not dissimilar to the action fraud type approach, really. We're trying to create a picture. So it's very successful in that regard, but I can certainly send you some details.
That would be really useful. And the other thing, sort of following on from that I'd like to have some information on is how many of the reports lead to investigations, which is not to say that they all should, because I think the campaign is very clear that it's about building up a picture and seeing where offenders or what time they're at and those kinds of things. But to know how many investigations result, and also by whom. I mean, presumably if it happens on the street and not on transport, you then pass it on to the Met to investigate.
We would.
That would be really useful to know. My final question is about CCTV, because there is CCTV on the tube and on all the public transport that you patrol. If the CCTV's in sort of national rail stations, is that run by Network Rail? As opposed, and TfL own the CCTV on the tube and the DLR?
Yes, so the CCTV system is owned, maintained and operated by whoever the owner of the property is.
So if you need CCTV evidence, you have to go to whoever owns it?
Not necessarily. So in London, we're very fortunate. We have a CCTV hub, which if you'd like to come and visit, we'd be delighted to show you. And that has an infrastructure that allows us to access around 55,000 cameras from most of the southeast train operators. The capability varies. On a Network Rail major station, we'd have access to 200 or 300 cameras perhaps. Some of the tube stations similarly, or you could get a more remote suburban station with 2 or 3 cameras on it. So it's a range of capabilities. But as the Commissioner said earlier, we've got structures in place that we bring that into a hub. We're able to access stuff remotely. We can look at recorded stuff. We can look at live. And if in many, but not all, but in many of the systems that we can access, we can share the image with the Met into the Specialist Operations Room live as those things are happening. So it's good. It needs constantly updating. So the technology is moving on. A lot of it's old technology. It's sort of fixed line networks. Actually, we need to move to a cloud base. There's lots of investment that's needed in this. We are talking to Deputy Mayor for Policing around sort of discussions around what a pan-London CCTV capability looks like and how we play into that.
So in relation, this relates to the reporting sexual offences side of things. If you wait a few days and then report it, the CCTV may not exist anymore. Is that this is the same? We asked questions before of the Met, and they went away and got us the retention times for CCTV on different modes of transport. It does vary from about 3 days up to about 28 days on some stations. Do those limits apply to you as well? I mean, you presumably your hub can only access this data for a certain amount of time until it's
standard is 28 days. So a standard is set around CCTV retention across the transport system.
That's like a recommended maximum time, isn't it?
No. I just need to check. I used to be the lead on this, but I think it's even written into franchise agreements around CCTV standards, and the retention period is part of that. But I'll check.
Yeah, we can exchange information, because we were given different numbers, especially on the tube, that it was quite a short period of time. But obviously, as systems get graded, it might be changed. There's
some difference around station-based CCTV and in-train CCTV, because that's recorded onto a hard drive in the train.
So for the victim, the heart of this is report it soon, or maybe the evidence can't be retrieved. And I just think that may be something that ought to be communicated as part of the campaign, because I don't know how often it happens that you get a report and you're not able to retrieve the evidence anymore.
It's not that frequent, actually. And actually what we've got is one of our proactive teams that we've got are quite literally, someone reports it, someone is researching quickly that day the CCTV, the next day they're out and they're arresting people on the basis of images they've got from an offence the day before. So there's quite a lot of success in that regard.
In that case, the evidence would still be there. Okay.
I think it's a good question about CCTV. I want to move it on time-wise. I mean, CCTV is a good question because, I mean, we've all had issues around CCTV retention when there's been incidents in our boroughs and over some years. So hopefully someone's capturing the request for data and information for yourself, and also other colleagues to write across, so we have some consistency about information about CCTV retention would be useful. I think that I'll just let it rest.
Can I just mention, your original question was about getting the evidence, and Sean, you'll probably be aware that from TfL now we are moving to a position very soon where we'll be able to, they can digitally upload all their information from their buses to us just like that, which is a great innovation by us, rather than me having to send every day officers out to collect a disc from a garage and they have to spend ages finding the right material for the garage. It's saving huge amounts of time.
Yeah, it does seem to be quite common, especially on buses, that evidence will disappear.
Now, I've had tragic events in Croydon 4 or 5, 6 years ago, longer than that, incident on bus, and no one was there to take that's moved on. But I think we need some information on that. But a couple of quick questions around this before we move on to the last piece. And Caroline, I think first.
I wanted to pick up issue here about safeguarding children, because that is an issue that crosses all of your forces. Young people going missing, they're vulnerable, linked to the county lines, the transport network, and so on. How are you linked up on that? Obviously, the Met have been criticised in terms of their safeguarding children work, some progress, but some concerns. How do you link in on that? Because particularly transport, you might see those young people by themselves going out to the counties or whatever.
Yes, so thank you. It's a really interesting and live topic, actually. So, and I'll come back to children specifically, but actually if you look at vulnerability in its widest sense, so the 13 strands of vulnerability, there are many people who are passing through the transport network who may be victims of or vulnerable in one of those sorts of areas that doesn't manifest itself in the transport network. So they're not being necessarily exploited in the transport network, but we come across them and are able to alert and feed into other agencies that are already interested in those individuals. So we've been putting a lot of effort into our internal processes. We've done lots of upskilling of officers around how to identify various degrees of vulnerability, particularly children, and some very interesting campaigns to identify how you can get beneath the initial thing that you're looking at. So children who present who might originally have come to the notice of a ticket inspector, for example, what's the underlying safeguarding issues there? But actually it relates back to so many parts of my answers earlier. We then link into the boroughs and the local structures where those children reside, or that vulnerable person resides, and link into the safeguarding teams there to make sure that then they're adopted and taken forward by those groups who have already got the structures around them to do it. So I think there are pretty mature structures in place. So we look at them centrally, we gather them into a central safeguarding team, who then make sure that they are referred and pointed and followed up with the appropriate local force, wherever that may be across England, Wales and Scotland.
And then perhaps the other way around, Caroline, would be, somebody goes missing, let's say hypothetically from a home, and the information comes in through 101, usually to say, Cresta Dick's gone missing again, and she's got a boyfriend in Southampton, might well be going there. We create one of our CAD messages straight away, and we can pass that straight away to BTP, and they'll be on the lookout for Cresta as she maybe goes through Waterloo and onto the train, at the same time as we're sending it through to Hampshire. If she's a 13-year-old person and this is a 26-year-old man, huge concerns. This is again, I'm afraid, happening every hour of the day.
It is working both ways. In the city, how do you get involved in
So we're involved in joint safeguarding boards with the Met. Our officers have had, following an HMIC report a couple of years ago actually, some enhanced training and awareness around CSE, particularly our frontline officers and our neighbourhood teams in particular have received training and some training specifically to link into the business community, like, for example, I'll give an example of hotels within the city, to brief hotels around CSE, the vulnerabilities alongside human trafficking, for example. So our neighbourhood teams have a key role to play in this at the front end, but all of our officers have had training around CSE. So we are very, very conjoined with our colleagues. There is Operation Make Safe, which is a joint Met, BTP and City operation to highlight awareness around CSE, which continues, which is across the three forces. So again, that collaborative effort is there at a lower operational level.
Do you have a question?
Yes, but it's not a short one, though.
Well, okay.
All right,
Try and make it short.
I'll try and make it short.
Best.
Yeah. Paul, I haven't actually had the chance to speak to a transport policeman, so it's a great opportunity. But I just wondered if there's been such a rise in sexual assaults on transport, as we have heard. I mean, just briefly, what do you put this down to? What, in your experience, do you put, if it's gone up so exponentially?
It's not. I don't think it's a rise in the incidence of sexual offences. I think it's a rise in the number of people who are reporting stuff that was going on. So take the tube system or many crowded trains that are coming into London during the rush hour. Sadly, there are people who perpetrate sexual assaults in that environment, and they've just gone unreported. So
that was going to be my second point, that actually surely, I mean, I'm on the tube every day and train, the sheer packed-innedness of people must surely make this easier.
Well, it certainly provides the facility to carry it out, yes. And of course it makes it difficult to detect as well.
It's less acceptance, quite rightly, of days of old when people might have shrugged it off. Now they will report it, and I think that's a good thing. Peter, did you want to continue, or was that your line of...
But I mean, we don't know that it's just down to reporting.
No, but that's for another, probably for another day or place. Thank you anyway. Last set of questions is around how is it important, and other conversations around the M word that Unmesh will be leading on first.
Thank you, Chair. As you'll be aware, Lord Toby Harris recommended that the Home Office should review whether there's value in merging police forces in London. The Mayor has not picked up on that recommendation. So looking to the future, can I ask each of you, what are your views on this subject? Would a unified London police service be for the better? And if so, how? And the other side of the coin, what might be lost by merging? So if I could start off with you, Assistant Commissioner.
So, as you rightly point out, the Mayor hasn't picked up that recommendation or continued to support that recommendation. I think the focus from the Mayor was very much around the spirit of the recommendation being around increased interoperability between the three forces, and that's certainly a view that the City of London Police share. The current arrangements within London, serving some fairly bespoke communities, but actually taking into consideration the wider London needs, I think are met effectively and efficiently by the three forces. We would take the view that in terms of collaboration, there is more to do in the future, undoubtedly, and as you'll have heard already, the commissioners and deputies will meet regularly to review those arrangements. Ultimately, it's a political decision for politicians and members to come to a recommendation or agreement on. From my personal perspective, and this is 32 years now policing London, these are the best arrangements I've seen during that time in terms of their effectiveness, and I'm certainly, from a City of London Police perspective, comfortable with the current service delivery methods within policing in London.
I asked you earlier about crime figures in the city, and as I said earlier, that there's no doubt you do excellent work in the field of economic crime. And you were unable, and I don't criticize you for this, you did not have the sort of the figures to give to me about non-economic crime, so I would be grateful if you could send us the figures for the last year or so to this committee in due course. But an argument has been put forward that would you be better off, I think the overwhelming bulk of your work is around economic crime, and of course all these things are relative, you've got a small population of 7,000 to 8,000, but would you be better off as a specialist economic crime unit of the Met? Only with the point.
Yes.
I mean, let's say. So the two moped crimes that I mentioned, there's a reason for that. I don't want to belittle those two incidents at all, but that was the front page of the local paper. Again, this is the relative. We've got 7,000 residents. In the Barking-Dagenham Post, it will probably be on page 30, because Barking-Dagenham, of course, has got a population of 300,000. So these things are relative. But the impression I get is that, as I say, you do this work really well, but the bulk of your work is around economic crime. You help other forces around the country. So would you be better off, as I say, as a specialist unit of the Met?
Okay, so I can answer that with a one-word answer, which my view is no. I would say that in relation to crimes like moped-enabled crime, and you mentioned the two that were on the front page of the Standard, I think...
Of the City Matters, your local paper.
The issue there is any crime of that nature that happens in the city has a high focus. It's a very affluent area, and therefore moped-enabled crime, on the pavements of the streets of the City of London is always going to have a focus. It's not unusual, and if I look back over the year to reporting in the Evening Standard, the Metro and other papers, it's common reporting. It's not a one-off as a one-off incident.
No.
You would justify your existence in independence.
As far as you got with that one.
We are a constitutionally separate police force with its own government arrangements and own constitution. So the answer is no. I'll refer back to my previous answer. It's not a question for me to answer in terms of should we. That's for others to consider.
So I start there as well. It is clearly a political decision at, as they say, the end of the day. However, I have already gone on record as saying, if any politician who asks me at the moment, do I think it would be sensible to try to merge in some sense, however the arrangement was, the Met and the City, or indeed the Met and that part of the BTP that polices London, I don't think it would be sensible at all. I don't think the operational benefits would outweigh some of the risks, and more to the point, the enormous costs and the extraordinary political wranglings that would go on for years and years and years when we've actually got some more important things to be dealing with, in my view. I think you've seen that it works really well. That isn't personality driven, it just does. A lot of the structures, a lot of the issues lend themselves to that. We're working better than we ever have. There's further to go. We can be slightly more effective. We probably can save a bit more money in the future. But for me, it really is a hiding to nothing to try to pursue this idea that merging would work. I've got colleagues here who have great specialisms that they bring to our party in London, and that's really helpful. And we work very, very well together.
Must you sort of do cooperate very well, although obviously you take a different view to that of your predecessor. So if I can come to you, Chief Constable.
So I agree agree with everything that's been said. I think additional point is we're not the London Transport Police, we're the British Transport Police. It's a national operation that looks at network-wide issues and delivers policing across that. Something that happens in one part of the country has a knock-on effect in another part of the country, including London, and it needs a network-wide approach. My response when I wrote to the Mayor was I pointed him towards the 7 in-depth reviews that have been carried out over about the last 11 years, each one of which concluded that a dedicated national transport police is the right way forward. So I agree with everything that's been said so far.
Just, I'll be very, very quick. Commissioner, you said in your opening that you did believe that you could collaborate more closely, and Assistant Commissioner, you mentioned that just now. Just, I'm mindful of the time. What one area would you all pick out that you could think that you could work in a better way? What would you like to see?
So, I mean, I look to the future, and it isn't just with these colleague forces, but I'm looking to a future where intelligence sharing in the non-CT world is even easier and smoother as we get our systems better aligned across national policing and have the ability to do, kind of better analysis together. And the second, I'm not allowed a second, but if I was, my second area would be the estate. I think, I'm not saying we're doing it badly, I'm just saying that as we look to the future, we're all in different collaborations, blue light collaborations, other things, but as we look to the future, there will be, I am sure, opportunities in our estate.
Thank you. Either of you got any other ideas?
I think an expanding area for all of us is how we operate in the digital space, so how we use technology. And I think there are huge opportunities for us in terms of joining up systems and using the same systems. We're looking at how we pick up and bring across to us the single online platform that the Met have developed, which is a fantastic route in for the public, and that ought to be seamless, that people can access and report things wherever they are, and it gets routed through to policing. So I think there's real opportunity as those digital methodologies play out in future years to make sure we're even closer tied up than we currently are.
And from a city perspective, I think just reiterating, certainly for me, systems access. So we've got good systems in place at the moment through the existing technology, but there are better systems available to us all in the future, whether that's intelligence sharing or whether that's through control rooms. So I think that's an area that we need to focus on. And of course, I think the obvious one for me in the short term is around estates.
Thank you very much.
I mean, surely the test on any debate around mergers is what's the best to keep Londoners safe. And we've heard today a lot of reassurance around that. Right, I thank Andrew briefly.
It's a short one, probably slightly mischievous to Paul, because you're not actually British Transport Police, you're British Railways Police, primarily. Is there a case to say we should have a British Transport Police? In other words, expanding your empire to include motorways, ports, airports?
Well,
then you would be transport police.
There's been quite a lot of work. Actually, we're more than railways, so we're light rail and all sorts of things like that.
And the airline.
But there's been quite a lot of work done on that very subject over the last 2 or 3 years. And actually, I think the conclusions that have broadly come from that are that the operational, the perceived operational benefits may not be outweighed by the complexity of making it happen, the cost and the legislative change that's required for it. So actually the focus is around collaboration and how people who operate in those different transport spaces share good practice and work more closely together.
Well pursued.
Having the last word, yes, of course, I think that's a very good question. And I think that needs to be looked at. Thank you very much, guests, again, for your appearance today. I'll try to keep time to what it should be. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Last couple of things. Item 7, can I note, can we note the updated work programme and the monthly report from the Mayor's Office and Policing? Item 8, the next meeting is Wednesday the 7th at 10 a.m. I have no other business. Thank you all for this afternoon's meeting.
GLA Chamber Sound.